The Philippine-American War is one of the most significant conflicts in American history that most Americans have never heard of. It's a war that fundamentally transformed the United States from a continental republic into a global empire. Yet it occupies barely a footnote in most history textbooks. While the Spanish-American War of 1898 gets all the glory with its Rough Riders and Remember the Maine rallying cries, the brutal 3-year war that followed in the Philippines is conveniently forgotten. This wasn't a minor skirmish. This was a full-scale war that would cost the lives of over 4,000 American soldiers and at minimum 200,000 Filipinos, though some estimates place Filipino deaths as high as 1 million when you account for civilians who died from disease, starvation, and the reconcentration camps. To put that in perspective, that's potentially more deaths than Americans suffered in the Vietnam War, and it happened in a country most Americans couldn't even locate on a map. The war began in February of 1899 and officially ended in July of 1902, though fighting would continue in the Muslim south of the Philippines until 1913. It was America's first major counterinsurgency war, our first experience fighting a guerrilla conflict in Asia, and it established patterns and precedents that would echo through American military interventions for the next century. The tactics used, the justifications given, the torture employed, the hearts and minds strategies attempted, the difficulties of distinguishing friend from foe, all of these would reappear again and again in American foreign policy. But here's what makes this war fascinating beyond just the military history. This conflict forces us to confront fundamental questions about American identity. Was the United States a liberating force bringing democracy and civilization to the world, or was it just another imperial power grabbing territory and resources? Could a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed justify ruling over people on the other side of the world who explicitly did not consent to that rule? These weren't just abstract philosophical debates. They were questions that American soldiers, politicians, and citizens grappled with in real time as the war unfolded. To understand how America ended up fighting a war against the very people it claimed to be liberating from Spanish rule, we need to go back, way back. We need to understand 300 years of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines. We need to understand the rise of Filipino nationalism. We need to understand America's imperial ambitions at the turn of the 20th century. We need to understand the Spanish-American War and the confusing, contradictory promises made to Filipino revolutionaries. And we need to understand how a series of miscommunications, cultural misunderstandings, and deliberate deceptions led to a moment on a bridge in February of 1899 when the first shots were fired. So, let's start at the beginning. Let's understand the Philippines before America ever arrived. Before we continue, if you feel a quiet pull to be here, go ahead and subscribe. Tap the button, get comfortable, and let the story unfold to the sound of soft rain. When Ferdinand Magellan first arrived in the Philippine archipelago in 1521, he stumbled onto a collection of islands that had been trading with Chinese, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants for centuries. These weren't primitive or uncivilized peoples waiting to be discovered. The Philippines had complex social structures, sophisticated trading networks, and diverse cultures. But Magellan saw an opportunity for Spain and for Christianity. Magellan himself didn't survive very long. He was killed by Lapu-Lapu, a local chieftain who didn't appreciate the Spanish trying to assert authority over his island. But Spain would return. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi established the first permanent Spanish settlement, and for the next 333 years, Spain would rule the Philippines. The Spanish colonial system in the Philippines was built on a few key pillars. First, there was the Catholic Church. Spain didn't just want to rule the Philippines politically, they wanted to convert the souls of the Filipinos, and they were remarkably successful. By the late 1800s, The vast majority of Filipinos in the lowlands were Catholic. The church owned enormous amounts of land and wielded tremendous power. Friars controlled not just spiritual life, but also education, local governance, and even economic activities. Second, there was the encomienda system. Under this arrangement, Spanish colonists were granted the right to extract tribute and labor from Filipino communities in exchange for supposedly protecting them and teaching them Christianity. In practice, this meant forced labor and economic exploitation. Filipinos had to pay tribute in the form of rice, gold, cloth, or other goods. They had to provide labor for Spanish projects, and they had very little say in any of it. Third, there was a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were the peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. Below them were the insulares, or criollos, Spaniards born in the Philippines. Below them were the mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and Filipino heritage. And at the bottom were the indios, the indigenous Filipinos who made up the vast majority of the population but had the least rights and opportunities. This system lasted for centuries, and for much of that time, it seemed stable. The Catholic Church provided a unifying force. The Spanish military could put down any local rebellions, and the geographic fragmentation of the Philippines, 7,000 islands with hundreds of different languages and ethnic groups, made unified resistance difficult. But several things began to change in the 19th century that would plant the seeds of revolution. First, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 dramatically reduced travel time between Europe and Asia. Suddenly, it was much easier for Filipinos to travel to Europe for education and for European ideas about liberalism, nationalism, and democracy to flow into the Philippines. Second, a new class of educated Filipinos emerged, the Ilustrados, which literally means the enlightened ones. These were Filipinos, often from mestizo families, who received education in Manila or even in Europe. They read the works of European philosophers. They saw how other colonized peoples were beginning to demand rights and representation. And they started asking uncomfortable questions. Why should the Philippines be governed by Spain? Why should friars from Spain control so much land and power? Why couldn't Filipinos govern themselves? Third, economic changes were creating new pressures. The Philippines was being integrated into global trade networks, exporting sugar, tobacco, and hemp. This created a class of Filipino landowners and businessmen who had economic power but no political power. They were wealthy enough to educate their children, travel, and develop connections, but they were still treated as second-class citizens in their own country. And fourth, Spain itself was weakening. By the late 1800s, Spain was no longer the global superpower it had been in the 16th century. It was losing its colonies in Latin America. It was facing internal political instability, and its ability to maintain control over a distant colony like the Philippines was increasingly in doubt. All of these factors created a perfect storm. Educated Filipinos began organizing. They began writing. They began demanding reforms. And when Spain refused those reforms, they began contemplating something more radical: independence. The story of Filipino nationalism really begins with a pen, not a sword. In the 1880s and 1890s, a group of young Filipino intellectuals living in Spain formed what became known as the propaganda movement. Their goal wasn't initially independence, it was reform. They wanted the Philippines to be treated as a province of Spain, not a colony. They wanted representation in the Spanish Parliament. They wanted an end to the abuses of the friars. They wanted equal rights for Filipinos. The leading figure of this movement was a young doctor and writer named Jose Rizal. Born in 1861 to a wealthy mestizo family, Rizal studied medicine in Manila and Spain, but his real weapon was his writing. In 1887, he published a novel called Noli Me Tangere, Touch Me Not. This novel, written in Spanish, was a devastating critique of Spanish colonial rule, and particularly of the corruption and abuses of the friars. The novel tells the story of Juan Crisostomo Ibarra, a young Filipino who returns to the Philippines after studying in Europe, full of idealistic plans to help his country. But he finds a society corrupted by the friars, where justice is perverted, where the innocent suffer, and where any attempt at reform is crushed. The novel was a sensation. It was smuggled into the Philippines and passed from hand to hand. Spanish authorities tried to ban it, which of course only made it more popular. Rizal followed this up in 1891 with a sequel, El Filibusterismo, The Filibuster. This novel was darker, angrier. The protagonist is no longer the idealistic reformer, but a embittered revolutionary plotting revenge. The message was clear. If Spain refused to reform, revolution might be the only answer. But Rizal himself remained committed to peaceful reform. He returned to the Philippines in 1892 and founded La Liga Filipina, an organization dedicated to uniting Filipinos and pushing for reforms through legal means. The Spanish authorities arrested him almost immediately and exiled him to a remote island called Dapitan. While Rizal was in exile, more radical forces were organizing. A man named Andres Bonifacio founded a secret society called the Katipunan in 1892. Unlike Rizal's reformist movement, the Katipunan was explicitly revolutionary. Its members took blood oaths. They prepared for armed uprising. They recruited members from the working classes, the people who had the most to gain from revolution and the least to lose. By 1896, the Katipunan had tens of thousands of members, though the exact number is disputed. They had organized cells throughout the provinces around Manila. They had stockpiled weapons, and they were ready to fight. The Spanish authorities discovered the conspiracy in August of 1896. Rather than surrender, Bonifacio and the Katipunan decided to launch their revolution immediately. On August 23, 1896, Katipunan members gathered in a place called Pugad Lawin, just outside Manila. There, they tore up their residency certificates, the documents that marked them as Spanish subjects, and cried out, "Mabuhay ang Pilipinas, long live the Philippines." This moment is known as the Cry of Pugad Lawin, and it marks the beginning of the Philippine Revolution. The revolution spread quickly through the provinces of Cavite, Bulacan, and other areas around Manila. Filipino rebels attacked Spanish garrisons, cut telegraph lines, and declared their independence. The Spanish responded with brutal force, executing suspected revolutionaries and burning villages suspected of supporting the rebels. And then the Spanish made a decision that would transform José Rizal from a reformist writer into a revolutionary martyr. Even though Rizal was in exile and had explicitly rejected armed revolution, the Spanish authorities decided to put him on trial for sedition and rebellion. The trial was a farce. The verdict was predetermined. On December 30, 1896, José Rizal was executed by firing squad in Manila. The Spanish hoped that executing Rizal would intimidate the revolutionaries into surrendering. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Rizal became a martyr, a symbol of Spanish oppression and Filipino resistance. His execution convinced many Filipinos who had hoped for peaceful reform that revolution was the only path forward. The Spanish had shot the man who might have saved them from a full-scale revolution. As the revolution spread, a new leader emerged who would come to dominate the story of the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War. His name was Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo was born in 1869 in Cavite, a province just south of Manila. He came from a relatively wealthy family. His father was the local mayor. Aguinaldo received a good education and became involved in local politics. When the Katipunan organized in Cavite, Aguinaldo joined. And when the revolution erupted in 1896, he proved to be a talented military leader. Aguinaldo won several early victories against Spanish forces. He was charismatic, intelligent, and strategically minded. He was also ambitious, and that ambition would lead to one of the darker episodes of the revolution. Andres Bonifacio, the founder of the Katipunan, remained the nominal leader of the revolution. But there were growing tensions between Bonifacio and Aguinaldo. Bonifacio came from the working class and represented the more radical, populist wing of the revolution. Aguinaldo came from the provincial elite and was seen as more moderate and politically sophisticated. There were also regional tensions. Bonifacio's base was in Manila and the surrounding areas, while Aguinaldo's was in Cavite. In March of 1897, the revolutionaries held an election at a convention in Tijeros to choose leaders for a revolutionary government. Aguinaldo was elected president. Bonifacio was elected to a lower position, Director of the Interior. But during the proceedings, someone questioned Bonifacio's qualifications, suggesting he wasn't educated enough for the position. Bonifacio, humiliated, declared the election invalid and left. What happened next is one of the great tragedies and controversies of Philippine history. Aguinaldo's forces arrested Bonifacio and his brother Procopio on charges of sedition and treason. They were put on trial, convicted, and on May 10, 1897, both brothers were executed in the mountains of Cavite. The official story was that Bonifacio had been plotting against Aguinaldo and the revolutionary government. Critics argue that Aguinaldo simply wanted to eliminate a rival. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's clear is that the revolution lost one of its most passionate leaders, and the revolutionary movement was divided at a crucial moment. Despite this internal conflict, Aguinaldo continued to lead the fight against Spain. But by the end of 1897, both sides were exhausted. The Spanish hadn't been able to crush the revolution, but the revolutionaries hadn't been able to drive out the Spanish. Both sides were ready for a negotiated settlement. On December 14 and 15, 1897, Aguinaldo and Spanish authorities signed the Pact of Biaknabato. Under this agreement, Aguinaldo and other revolutionary leaders would go into exile in Hong Kong. In exchange, Spain would pay them 400,000 pesos, with another 400,000 to be distributed to other revolutionaries. Spain also promised reforms in the Philippines. Aguinaldo and his companions left for Hong Kong with a considerable sum of money. Some critics would later accuse him of selling out the revolution for cash. Aguinaldo's defenders argue he was being pragmatic, taking the money, regrouping, and preparing for a future fight. As it turned out, that future fight would come much sooner than anyone expected, and it wouldn't be against Spain. While Filipinos were fighting for independence from Spain, the United States was undergoing its own transformation. For most of its history, America had been focused inward. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 had essentially said, "Europe, stay out of the Americas, and we'll stay out of your business." America was busy expanding across the continent, fighting a civil war, rebuilding after that war, and industrializing. But by the 1890s, something was changing in American thinking about the country's place in the world. First, there was the closing of the frontier. In 1890, the Census Bureau announced that there was no longer a clear line of frontier settlement in the American West. This created anxiety among American leaders. The frontier had been central to American identity. It was where people went to start over, where opportunity existed, where American individualism flourished. If the continental frontier was closed, where would American energy and ambition go? Second, there was the economic panic of 1893, one of the worst depressions in American history up to that point. Businesses failed, unemployment soared, and there were violent labor strikes. Some American leaders began arguing that the solution was to expand American trade and influence abroad. We needed new markets for American goods, new sources of raw materials, and new opportunities for investment. Third, there was a popular theory about naval power promoted by a naval officer and historian named Alfred Thayer Mahan. In 1890, Mahan published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which argued that great nations needed great navies, and great navies needed overseas bases and coaling stations. This book became enormously influential among American political and military leaders. Fourth, there was a growing sense that America needed to compete with the European powers. By the 1890s, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and other European nations had carved up much of Africa and Asia into colonies and spheres of influence. There was a fear that America was being left behind, that all the desirable territories would be taken before America got its share. And fifth, there was an ideology that justified all of this, the idea of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority and America's civilizing mission. Many Americans, including prominent politicians and intellectuals, believed that Anglo-Saxons were inherently superior to other races and had a duty to spread civilization, Christianity, and democracy to the backwards peoples of the world. This wasn't just fringe thinking. These were mainstream ideas promoted in schools, churches, and newspapers. The British poet Rudyard Kipling would later capture this ideology in his 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, which was actually written to encourage Americans to take up colonial rule in the Philippines. The poem portrayed colonialism as a noble, self-sacrificing duty to civilize the world's lesser peoples. Today, we recognize this for what it was, a racist justification for imperial conquest. But in the 1890s, millions of Americans found it persuasive. All of these factors, economic anxiety, naval theory, great power competition, and racist ideology, were pushing America toward overseas expansion. But there was resistance too. Many Americans believed that imperialism contradicted American values. How could a nation founded on the principle of self-government justify ruling over other peoples without their consent? How could a nation that had itself fought for independence from a colonial power turn around and deny independence to others? This debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists would intensify dramatically after 1898. But in the mid-1890s, it was still largely theoretical. America didn't actually have any overseas colonies yet, just some scattered island possessions like Hawaii, which would be annexed in 1898. All of that was about to change, because American attention was increasingly focused on a nearby island where colonial rule was becoming increasingly unstable, Cuba. Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, had been fighting for independence from Spain off and on for decades. In 1895, a new revolution erupted. Spanish authorities responded with brutal tactics, including reconcentration camps where Cuban civilians were forcibly relocated. Thousands died from disease and starvation in these camps. American newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, covered the Cuban Revolution extensively. This was the age of yellow journalism, where sensational, often exaggerated stories sold papers. Headlines screamed about Spanish atrocities. Stories were illustrated with dramatic pictures that were sometimes staged or fabricated. American public opinion increasingly sympathized with the Cuban rebels. American business interests were also concerned about Cuba. Americans had invested heavily in Cuban sugar plantations and other industries. The fighting was disrupting trade and threatening those investments. Some Americans argued that the United States needed to intervene to restore order and protect American economic interests. President William McKinley, who took office in March of 1897, was initially reluctant to intervene. He wanted a diplomatic solution. But pressure was building, both from the public and from more hawkish members of his own Republican Party, including Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Then, on February 15, 1898, an event occurred that made war nearly inevitable. The USS Maine, an American battleship that had been sent to Havana Harbor to protect American citizens and interests, mysteriously exploded and sank. 266 American sailors died. To this day, we don't know for certain what caused the explosion. It could have been a Spanish mine, though Spain had no rational motive to attack an American warship. It could have been an accident, a coal bunker fire igniting ammunition. Modern analysis suggests it was probably an accident. But in 1898, the American press and public had no doubt. Spain had sunk the Maine. "Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain!" became the rallying cry. War fever gripped the nation. McKinley tried to resist, but the pressure became overwhelming. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. Now, here's where the Philippines enters the story in a way that most Americans didn't expect or even understand. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt had been preparing for war for months. He had a plan. If war came with Spain, the U.S., Navy shouldn't just focus on Cuba. It should also attack Spain's Pacific possessions, particularly the Philippines. This would pressure Spain from multiple directions and potentially give the United States valuable territory in Asia. Roosevelt had stationed a naval squadron in Hong Kong under the command of Commodore George Dewey, with orders to be ready to attack the Spanish fleet in Manila if war was declared. When war came, Dewey acted quickly. On May 1, 1898, Dewey's squadron entered Manila Bay and engaged the Spanish Pacific Fleet. The battle was astonishingly one-sided. The Spanish ships were old and poorly maintained. The American ships were modern and well-trained. Within a few hours, the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed. 10 ships sunk or captured. Spanish casualties were 381 killed or wounded. American casualties, 9 wounded, none killed. Dewey's famous order to his flagship captain, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley," became part of American naval legend. It was a stunning, complete victory. Americans celebrated. Dewey became a national hero overnight. But there was a problem. Dewey had destroyed the Spanish fleet, but he didn't have enough forces to capture Manila itself. The city was defended by Spanish troops on land. Dewey's ships controlled the bay, but he couldn't occupy the city. He needed infantry, and the nearest American infantry were thousands of miles away. Dewey sent urgent cables back to Washington. "Send troops. I've destroyed the Spanish fleet, but I need army forces to take Manila." While waiting for American reinforcements, Dewey needed allies on the ground, and he knew just where to find them. Remember Emilio Aguinaldo? He had been in exile in Hong Kong since the Pact of Biaknabato in December of 1897. When the Spanish-American War broke out and Dewey sailed for Manila, American officials made contact with Aguinaldo. What exactly was said in these conversations is one of the most contentious historical questions of the entire war. Aguinaldo claimed that American representatives promised him that the United States would support Philippine independence if he helped fight against Spain. American officials later denied making any such promises. The truth is murky, probably deliberately so. What we know for certain is this. On May 19, 1898, Aguinaldo returned to the Philippines aboard an American naval vessel. He immediately began reorganizing Filipino revolutionary forces. He issued proclamations calling on Filipinos to rise up against Spain. He told people that America was their ally in the fight for independence. Filipino forces responded enthusiastically. Within weeks, Aguinaldo had organized an army of thousands. They surrounded Manila, cutting off the Spanish from the countryside. They captured town after town. By June, Filipino forces controlled most of Luzon except for Manila itself and a few Spanish fortresses. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo made a momentous declaration. Standing on the balcony of his house in Cavite, with a crowd of supporters and a Philippine flag flying overhead, he declared Philippine independence. A national anthem was played. A declaration of independence was read aloud, proclaiming the Philippines from this day forth free, sovereign, and independent. The declaration cited the Philippine Revolution that had begun in 1896 and praised the most fortunate help of the United States Navy. Aguinaldo and many Filipinos believed they were fighting alongside Americans as allies in a common cause, defeating Spain and establishing Philippine independence. But did the Americans see it the same way? The answer is, it depended on who you asked. Some American officials on the ground, like Dewey and his representatives, may have been deliberately vague to maintain Filipino cooperation. They needed Filipino forces to help bottle up the Spanish while waiting for American reinforcements. Back in Washington, however, the thinking was very different. President McKinley and his advisors were increasingly viewing the Philippines as potential American territory. They hadn't decided yet what to do with the islands, but they definitely weren't thinking about simply handing them over to Aguinaldo. In August of 1898, American troops finally arrived in the Philippines, around 11,000 soldiers under the command of General Wesley Merritt. The Spanish in Manila were surrounded and running out of supplies. They knew the war was lost. But they faced a dilemma. They would rather surrender to the Americans than to the Filipinos, whom they viewed as racial inferiors and rebels. The Americans and Spanish worked out a deal. There would be a staged battle for Manila. The Spanish would offer token resistance and then surrender to American forces. Crucially, Filipino forces would be kept out of the city. The Americans would take Manila, not the Filipinos. On August 13, 1898, this plan was executed. There was some actual fighting. Some Spanish commanders didn't get the memo about surrendering, and American and Spanish soldiers fired on each other. 14 Americans and 49 Spanish soldiers were killed, but by the end of the day, American forces occupied Manila, and the Spanish had surrendered. Aguinaldo and his forces were furious. They had done most of the fighting against Spain for months. They had surrounded Manila. They believed they were America's allies, and now they were being kept out of the city they had helped to capture. Relations between American and Filipino forces immediately became tense. Filipino forces surrounded the city from the outside, while American forces held the interior. There was a neutral zone between them, but tensions kept rising. Meanwhile, back in Washington, diplomats were negotiating the Treaty of Paris that would officially end the Spanish-American War and determine the fate of Spain's colonies. The peace negotiations between the United States and Spain took place in Paris in the fall of 1898. The big questions on the table: what would happen to Cuba? What would happen to Puerto Rico? What would happen to Guam? And most consequentially, what would happen to the Philippines? Cuba was relatively straightforward. The United States had gone to war explicitly to free Cuba from Spanish rule. America would occupy Cuba temporarily but wouldn't annex it. Cuba would eventually become independent, though the U.S. would maintain significant influence. Puerto Rico and Guam would be ceded to the United States. But the Philippines? That was the subject of intense debate, both in the negotiating room and in American public opinion. President McKinley had to make a decision. The options were: 1. Give the Philippines back to Spain. This was politically impossible after Americans had died fighting there. 2. Allow the Philippines to become independent under Aguinaldo. This was opposed by American business interests who wanted access to Asian markets, by naval strategists who wanted bases in the Pacific, and by politicians who worried that an independent Philippines would fall under the influence of another power like Germany or Japan. 3. Take only Manila and perhaps some naval bases. This was a compromise position but would leave the status of the rest of the islands ambiguous. 4. Take the entire Philippine archipelago as an American colony. McKinley agonized over this decision. He later told a group of Methodist ministers about his decision-making process. According to McKinley's account, and we should take it with a grain of salt since he was justifying his decision, he walked the floor of the White House night after night, praying for guidance. McKinley claimed he came to his decision through a process of elimination and divine inspiration. He said, "I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance. And one night late it came to me this way, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, and to educate the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them." The irony of this last statement, that Americans needed to Christianize the Filipinos, is striking. Since the Philippines had been Catholic for 300 years and was already more Christian than the United States in many ways. But this reveals the deep ignorance and racial prejudice underlying American thinking. Many Americans simply assumed that non-white peoples couldn't be truly civilized or Christian, even when they demonstrably were. McKinley's decision. The United States would take all of the Philippines. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. Spain was out, America was in. The treaty had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, and this triggered a massive national debate. Anti-imperialists, including prominent Americans like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, former President Grover Cleveland, and industrialist Andrew Carnegie, formed the Anti-Imperialist League. They argued that imperialism contradicted American values, that it would be enormously costly, that it would entangle America in Asian conflicts, and that it was fundamentally racist and wrong. Mark Twain wrote scathingly about American policy in the Philippines. He suggested redesigning the American flag with skull and crossbones instead of stars. He wrote bitter satires about the blessings of civilization trust, bringing civilization to the Filipinos at gunpoint. But the imperialists had powerful arguments too. They argued that American control would bring peace, prosperity, education, and good government to the Philippines. They argued that America needed bases in Asia to compete with European powers. They argued that if America didn't take the Philippines, some other power would, and that power might be hostile to American interests. The debate was fierce, but the imperialists won. On February 6, 1899, the Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris by a vote of 57 to 27, just one vote more than the two-thirds majority required. The United States now owned the Philippines. There was just one problem. Nobody had asked the Filipinos what they wanted, and they had made it very clear that they wanted independence. In the months between the American occupation of Manila in August of 1898 and the Senate ratification of the Treaty of Paris in February 1899, tensions between American and Filipino forces steadily escalated. The Americans controlled Manila. Aguinaldo's forces controlled most of the rest of Luzon and other islands. Aguinaldo had established a government, written a constitution, the Malolos Constitution, adopted in January 1899, and organized an army. As far as he was concerned, the Philippines was an independent nation. He expected the Americans to recognize this and leave. The Americans had very different ideas. As far as they were concerned, they had purchased the Philippines from Spain. It was American territory now. Aguinaldo's government had no legitimacy. The Filipinos would need to accept American sovereignty. There was a narrow, neutral zone between American and Filipino positions around Manila. American soldiers manned positions on one side. Filipino soldiers manned positions on the other side. They could see each other. They patrolled the same streets. Incidents multiplied. The cultural clash between American soldiers and Filipinos intensified tensions. Many American soldiers brought with them the racial attitudes common in the United States at the time. This was the era of Jim Crow segregation. These soldiers used racial slurs when referring to Filipinos. They called them gugus, or niggers. They viewed Filipinos as racially inferior and incapable of self-government. Filipino soldiers and civilians, in turn, grew increasingly resentful of American attitudes and actions. They had fought for their independence. They had defeated the Spanish. And now these Americans were coming in, treating them like children or savages, and claiming ownership of their country. Both sides prepared for war. The Americans brought in more troops. By the end of 1898 and early 1899, there were over 20,000 American soldiers in the Philippines. General Elwell Otis, who had replaced Merritt as commander, drilled his troops and fortified American positions. Aguinaldo, meanwhile, organized his forces and stockpiled weapons. He held out hope that the American Senate would reject the Treaty of Paris and that American anti-imperialists would prevail. When news reached the Philippines that the Senate had ratified the treaty, it was a crushing blow to Filipino hopes for a peaceful resolution. In late January and early February of 1899, Aguinaldo and his advisors debated what to do. Some counseled patience. Perhaps American public opinion would shift. Perhaps the Americans would come to see reason. Others argued for immediate action. If war was inevitable, better to strike first. The decision ultimately wasn't made by Aguinaldo in some grand council of war. It was made on a bridge on the night of February 4, 1899, by soldiers on both sides who were tired, nervous, and primed for conflict. February 4, 1899, was a Saturday night in Manila. It was hot and humid, as it always was in the Philippines. Along the neutral zone, separating American and Filipino positions, soldiers on both sides were on edge. Near the San Juan Bridge, American sentries from the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry were on patrol. These weren't professional soldiers. They were volunteers, citizens who had enlisted to fight in what they thought would be a quick, glorious war. They were far from home, in a confusing situation, facing an enemy they didn't understand. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, 4 Filipino soldiers approached the American lines near the bridge. What happened next is disputed, and we'll probably never know the exact truth. According to the American account, the Filipino soldiers ignored challenges to halt and continued advancing. Private William Grayson, a sentry, called out, "Halt! Who goes there?" The Filipino soldiers didn't stop. Grayson called out again. Still no response. Grayson fired, killing one of the Filipino soldiers. According to the Filipino account, their soldiers were on their own side of the neutral zone or had simply gotten lost. The Americans fired without adequate warning. The first shots were an American provocation. What's certain is that after that first shot, both sides opened fire all along the line. The shooting rapidly escalated. Within minutes, fighting had spread across the entire American-Filipino front around Manila. Artillery began firing. Thousands of soldiers engaged. General Otis, the American commander, had actually been expecting something like this. He had authorized his officers to open fire if Filipino forces crossed into American-controlled territory. Whether the Filipino soldiers had actually crossed the line, or whether American soldiers were looking for an excuse to shoot, we can't say for sure. Aguinaldo, on hearing the shooting, immediately sent a message to General Otis proposing a ceasefire and an investigation. But it was too late. The shooting continued through the night and into the next day. February 5, 1899, saw the first major battle of the war. American forces, with superior firepower and artillery, pushed Filipino forces back. The Filipinos fought hard. They had enthusiasm and were fighting for their homes, but they lacked the modern weapons and training of the Americans. By the end of February 5, American forces had broken through Filipino lines and were advancing beyond Manila. Filipino casualties were high. Estimates range from 2,000 to 5,000 killed or wounded in the first 2 days of fighting. American casualties were much lower, about 250 killed or wounded. Both sides claimed the other had started the war. The Americans said the Filipinos had provoked the conflict by attacking their positions. The Filipinos said the Americans had fired first and were the aggressors. To be honest, it probably doesn't matter who fired the first shot. War had been coming for months. The tensions were too high, the positions too irreconcilable, the cultural misunderstandings too deep. That shot at the San Juan Bridge was just the spark that lit a fire that had been waiting to burn. President McKinley, informed of the fighting, declared that the Filipinos had attacked American forces and that American troops would now have to suppress the insurrection. Notice the language. Not a war between two nations, but an insurrection against American authority. From the American government's perspective, the Filipinos were rebels against legitimate American rule, not soldiers of a nation fighting for independence. Aguinaldo issued his own proclamation, calling on all Filipinos to rise up against American aggression. He framed the conflict as a war of independence, comparing it to America's own revolution against Britain. The Philippine-American War had begun. It would be far longer, far bloodier, and far more controversial than anyone in America expected. In the first months of the war, from February through November of 1899, the conflict looked like a conventional war between two armies. The Americans had major advantages in almost every category: better weapons, better training, more supplies, and naval support. American soldiers carried the Krag-Jurgensen rifle, a modern bolt-action repeating rifle that could fire multiple rounds quickly and accurately at long range. They had modern artillery, Gatling guns, an early form of machine gun, and plentiful ammunition. They had a sophisticated logistics system that could keep them supplied with food, medicine, and equipment. Filipino soldiers, by contrast, mostly carried a motley collection of older weapons. Some had modern Mausers captured from the Spanish or purchased abroad, but many carried old Spanish rifles from the 1840s and 50s. Some carried bolos, machetes, as their primary weapon. Ammunition was scarce and often didn't match the variety of rifles they possessed. Artillery was limited and often ineffective. But the Filipinos had advantages too. They knew the terrain. They had the support of the local population. They were fighting for their homes and their independence. And they had the motivation that comes from defending your homeland against foreign invasion. The opening battle at Manila set the pattern for the conventional phase of the war. American forces would advance. Filipino forces would resist stubbornly, but would eventually be forced to retreat by American firepower. The Americans would occupy the town or position. The Filipinos would regroup and prepare for the next engagement. The casualties reflected this pattern too. In any given battle, Filipinos would typically suffer 10 to 20 times more casualties than the Americans. This wasn't because Filipino soldiers weren't brave. They were often extraordinarily courageous, sometimes recklessly so. It was because they were trying to fight a conventional war against an enemy with overwhelmingly superior firepower. After breaking through Filipino lines around Manila in early February, American forces pushed north toward Malolos, the capital of Aguinaldo's revolutionary government. This was a symbolic target as well as a strategic one. Capturing Malolos would demonstrate that Aguinaldo's government was a fiction, that the Americans controlled the country. The campaign for Malolos took shape over several weeks. General Arthur MacArthur, yes, the father of Douglas MacArthur of World War II fame, led American forces north along the railroad line. His troops faced sporadic resistance, with Filipino forces making stands at river crossings and defensive positions. One significant engagement occurred at the Tuliahan River on February 10, 1899, just days after the war began. Filipino forces had dug in along the river, creating trenches and defensive works. The Americans advanced, and a fierce firefight erupted. The Filipinos fought hard, but American artillery and superior rifles eventually forced them to withdraw. American casualties were light, about 50 killed or wounded. Filipino casualties were estimated at 500 to 700. The pattern repeated at Caloocan, at Malabon, at each river and defensive line. Filipino forces would resist. American firepower would overwhelm them. The Filipinos would retreat, regroup, and prepare to make another stand. On March 31, 1899, American forces captured Malolos. Aguinaldo and his government fled north, eventually establishing a new capital at San Fernando and later moving even further north to Tarlac and then into the mountains. The fall of Malolos was a major propaganda victory for the Americans. General Otis sent triumphant reports back to Washington declaring that the insurrection was nearly crushed. American newspapers proclaimed that the war would soon be over. Volunteers who had enlisted for short terms thought they'd be home soon. They were wrong. The problem was that capturing cities and towns didn't mean controlling the countryside. As soon as American forces moved on to the next objective, Filipino forces would often move back into areas they'd supposedly been cleared from. The Americans were learning a lesson that would be relearned in many future wars. Holding territory is much harder than taking it. Moreover, Aguinaldo and his commanders were learning that they couldn't win a conventional war against the Americans. They needed to change tactics. But before they fully made that transition, the conventional war would continue through the hot, wet summer of 1899. One of the key American commanders during this phase was General Henry Lawton. Lawton was a Civil War veteran and Indian fighter who had captured the Apache leader Geronimo. He was aggressive, energetic, and popular with his troops. In the summer of 1899, Lawton led campaigns in southern Luzon and around Laguna de Bay. Lawton's operations were characterized by rapid movement and aggressive pursuit of Filipino forces. He believed that the key to victory was to keep the pressure on constantly, never allowing the Filipinos to rest or reorganize. His troops marched long distances in brutal heat and humidity, fighting when they encountered enemy forces, then pushing on. The campaigns were successful in military terms. American forces captured town after town, but they were also exhausting and frustrating. Towns captured one week would need to be recaptured the next. Filipino forces melted away into the countryside, only to reemerge somewhere else. And casualties from tropical diseases were mounting. Disease was, in fact, the greatest killer of American soldiers during the war. Malaria, dysentery, cholera, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases ravaged American units. In some regiments, half or more of the men would be on sick call at any given time. Men died not in dramatic battles, but in field hospitals, wasting away from fever and dehydration. The experience of American soldiers in the Philippines was often one of confusion, frustration, and moral compromise. Many had enlisted expecting a glorious adventure, a chance to serve their country and perhaps see the world. What they got was something very different. Letters home from soldiers reveal the reality of the war. They wrote about the oppressive heat and humidity, about uniforms that never dried out from sweat and rain, about boots that rotted on their feet. They wrote about the insects, mosquitoes, flies, leeches, ants that were everywhere, constantly biting and spreading disease. They wrote about the food, which was often spoiled or infested with weevils by the time it reached them. They wrote about the landscape, which was both beautiful and treacherous. The Philippines could be breathtakingly gorgeous, emerald rice paddies, dramatic mountains, pristine beaches, but it could also be a nightmare to operate in. Jungles so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, rivers that could go from ankle deep to chest deep in an afternoon rainstorm, volcanic soil that turned into impassable mud when it rained. They wrote about the frustration of fighting an enemy they rarely saw. Imagine marching for hours in brutal heat, your unit spread out along a narrow trail through the jungle. Suddenly, shots ring out from the vegetation. Men fall. You return fire, but you can't see the enemy. By the time you reach where the shots came from, the enemy is gone. You find nothing but empty shell casings and footprints. This happened day after day, week after week. They wrote about the moral challenges. What do you do when you're ordered to burn a village? When you're told to interrogate a prisoner using the water cure? When you see your friends killed by people who look like peaceful farmers? Some soldiers expressed regret and shame about what they were ordered to do. Others hardened themselves and embraced harsh tactics. Many tried not to think too much about it and just focused on surviving and getting home. The racial attitudes of American soldiers are also evident in their letters and memoirs. The casual racism, the dehumanizing language, the assumption of superiority, these were pervasive. But there were also moments of connection, of recognizing common humanity. Some soldiers developed friendships with Filipino guides or translators. Some expressed admiration for Filipino courage or family values. The picture that emerges is complex, not simply of racist colonial soldiers, but of young men navigating a confusing and morally ambiguous situation with limited information and lots of propaganda. The class divisions among American forces also mattered. The volunteer regiments that made up much of the early American force were often made up of working class and rural men. The officers were more likely to be middle or upper class, often with college education. This created tensions. The officers sometimes viewed their own men as barely more civilized than the Filipinos they were fighting. The enlisted men sometimes resented officers who seemed more concerned with their careers than with the welfare of their troops. The regular army units that increasingly took over as the war went on had their own culture. These were professional soldiers, not volunteers. Many were immigrants or first-generation Americans. Some had fought in the Indian Wars on the American frontier. They brought with them attitudes and tactics from those conflicts, including the view that harsh measures against savages were acceptable. African American soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, faced their own unique challenges. They were fighting to extend American rule over non-white people while themselves being denied full rights at home. Some African American soldiers questioned what they were doing. Some deserted and joined the Filipino side. Others served loyally, hoping that their service would help the cause of racial justice at home. It mostly didn't. The rainy season, from June to November, made everything worse. Roads became impassable mud, rivers flooded, supplies couldn't get through, disease spread more rapidly. And the Filipino forces, accustomed to these conditions, could use the weather to their advantage. Meanwhile, both the American and Filipino commanders were dealing with internal challenges. Emilio Aguinaldo faced the tremendous challenge of holding together a revolutionary movement while being hunted by a superior military force. He had to manage not just military operations but also the political and diplomatic aspects of the struggle. Aguinaldo's government in exile continued to function even as it retreated from one temporary capital to another. He maintained a cabinet, issued proclamations, collected taxes where possible, and tried to win international recognition and support for Filipino independence. The international diplomacy was crucial but ultimately disappointing. Aguinaldo and other Filipino leaders hoped that other nations, perhaps Japan or Britain or even other Asian countries, would recognize Philippine independence and pressure the United States to withdraw. They hoped that the American anti-imperialist movement would gain enough strength to change U.S. policy. These hopes were never realized. Other nations, while sometimes sympathetic, weren't willing to confront the United States over the Philippines. The anti-imperialist movement in America, while vocal, couldn't overcome the political momentum behind American imperialism. Aguinaldo's greatest military asset was a brilliant general named Antonio Luna. Luna was a pharmacist and scientist by training, but he had studied military science and proved to be a skilled tactician and strategist. He was also hot-tempered, demanding, and willing to discipline or even execute soldiers who didn't meet his standards. Luna understood that the Filipinos couldn't win a conventional war against the Americans. He advocated for guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, avoiding direct confrontation with superior American forces. He wanted to make the war so costly and frustrating for the Americans that they would eventually give up and leave. But Luna also made enemies within the Filipino revolutionary movement. His harsh discipline alienated some commanders. His close relationship with Apolinario Mabini, Aguinaldo's advisor, created political complications, and some suspected that Luna had ambitions to replace Aguinaldo as leader of the revolution. In June of 1899, a tragedy occurred that would haunt the revolution and Aguinaldo's reputation forever. Luna was summoned to meet with Aguinaldo at the headquarters in Cabanatuan. On June 5, as Luna arrived, he was attacked and killed by soldiers loyal to Aguinaldo. His aide was also murdered. The exact circumstances remain controversial. Was it an assassination ordered by Aguinaldo? Was it a spontaneous attack by soldiers who hated Luna's harsh discipline? Did Aguinaldo know about it in advance, or was he shocked when it happened? Aguinaldo's defenders say he had nothing to do with it and was horrified by Luna's death. His critics point out that Luna was killed by Aguinaldo's own guards, and that Aguinaldo didn't punish anyone for the murder. They note the parallel to Bonifacio's death 2 years earlier. They suggest Aguinaldo had a pattern of eliminating potential rivals. Whatever the truth, Luna's death was a disaster for the Filipino military effort. He was their most talented general, and his loss left a void that was never filled. The Revolutionary Army lost coherence and coordination after his death. As the conventional war continued through the summer and fall of 1899, Filipino forces won occasional victories but more often suffered defeats. They were running out of ammunition, weapons, and supplies. Desertions increased. Some Filipino soldiers and even some officers decided to surrender or switch sides. The Americans, meanwhile, were also facing challenges that made them question the narrative of an easy victory. Back home, the American public had been told that the Filipino insurrection would be crushed quickly. But as the months wore on and the war continued, questions began to emerge. Casualties were mounting, not primarily from combat but from disease. Letters from soldiers in the Philippines told stories of brutal conditions, of men dying from malaria and dysentery, of long marches through jungles and swamps, of an enemy that wouldn't stand and fight but melted away into the population. Reports of atrocities also began to emerge. Some American soldiers wrote home about burning villages, about killing prisoners, about the harsh treatment of Filipino civilians suspected of supporting the insurgents. These reports were often censored or suppressed, but some leaked out. General Otis, the overall American commander, was part of the problem. He was optimistic to the point of delusion, constantly sending reports back to Washington, claiming that victory was just around the corner, that the insurrection was almost crushed. This created unrealistic expectations. Otis was also unpopular with many of his officers and men. They saw him as out of touch, more concerned with managing public relations than with the realities on the ground. Some officers, including both MacArthur and Lawton, chafed under his command. The logistics of fighting a war on the other side of the world were also proving difficult. Supplies had to be shipped from the United States or obtained locally. Communications were slow. A message from Washington to Manila could take weeks. Coordinating strategy was difficult when there was such a long lag time between question and answer. Perhaps most frustrating for American forces was the difficulty of identifying the enemy. In conventional battles, you could see the enemy army arrayed against you. But as Filipino forces increasingly adopted guerrilla tactics, the line between civilian and combatant became blurred. A farmer working in his rice paddy during the day might be a guerrilla fighter at night. A village that seemed peaceful might be supplying food and information to insurgent forces. Women and children might be carrying messages or supplies. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? This ambiguity would lead to some of the war's worst atrocities, as frustrated American soldiers increasingly saw all Filipinos as potential enemies. The presidential election of 1900 added another dimension. William McKinley was running for re-election, and his opponent, William Jennings Bryan, made American imperialism in the Philippines a major campaign issue. Bryan and the Democrats argued that the war was unjust, costly, and contrary to American values. McKinley and the Republicans defended the war as a necessary part of America's civilizing mission. They argued that abandoning the Philippines would be a betrayal of American soldiers who had died there and would leave the Filipinos in chaos. The election was fought partly over the issue of the Philippines, though it wasn't the only issue. McKinley won re-election, which the Republicans claimed was a mandate to continue the war. But Bryan had won enough votes to show that a significant portion of Americans had doubts about the imperial project. As 1899 turned into 1900, the character of the war was shifting. The conventional battles of the early months were giving way to something more ambiguous and more brutal: a guerrilla war. By late 1899 and early 1900, it was clear to Filipino commanders that they couldn't win a conventional war. They lacked the weapons, the ammunition, and the training to defeat American forces in open battle. But they could make the occupation so costly and frustrating that the Americans might eventually give up. Aguinaldo, operating from mountain hideouts in northern Luzon, issued orders for a general shift to guerrilla tactics. The strategy was straightforward: avoid large battles, attack isolated outposts and patrols, cut supply lines, ambush small units, make the countryside unsafe for American forces, and demonstrate that the Americans couldn't control the country. This strategy played to Filipino strengths. They knew the terrain intimately. They had the support of much of the population, who could provide food, shelter, and intelligence. They could blend in with civilians. And they had time, they were fighting for their homes, and could wait out the Americans. The guerrilla war took many forms. Sometimes it was a large-scale ambush of an American patrol. Sometimes it was a nighttime raid on a garrison. Sometimes it was simply cutting telegraph wires or destroying bridges. The goal was to force the Americans to garrison troops everywhere, spreading them thin and to make them feel like they were never safe. Filipino guerrillas also targeted Filipinos who collaborated with the Americans. Local officials appointed by the American occupation government were assassinated. Filipinos who provided information to American forces were punished or killed. This was partly to maintain security collaborators were a threat, but it was also to send a message. The revolution was still alive, and those who betrayed it would pay. The guerrilla warfare was incredibly effective at frustrating American forces. American patrols would march to a village where insurgents had been reported, only to find peaceful farmers who claimed to know nothing. American garrisons would be attacked at night by guerrillas who would then disappear. Supplies would be destroyed, sentries would be killed, and the Americans could never seem to bring the enemy to battle. One advantage the Filipinos had was a sophisticated intelligence network. Local residents would observe American movements and report them to guerrilla commanders. Messages would be passed from village to village, often by women and children who the Americans were less likely to search or suspect. Guerrilla forces often knew where American troops were and what they were planning before the Americans moved. The Americans, by contrast, struggled to gather intelligence. They didn't speak the local languages. They couldn't tell who was a guerrilla and who was a civilian. Their own informants were often unreliable or feeding them false information. They were operating in a hostile environment where almost every piece of information was suspect. This information asymmetry led to increasing frustration and paranoia among American forces. If you couldn't trust anyone, if any civilian might be a guerrilla or a spy, how do you fight? The answer that many American soldiers arrived at was harsh. Treat all Filipinos as potential enemies. Use harsh interrogation methods to extract information, and punish civilians who were suspected of supporting the insurgency. This led to a vicious cycle. Harsh treatment of civilians pushed more people to support the guerrillas. More support for the guerrillas led to more American frustration and harsher tactics. The war became increasingly brutal. Not all Americans favored a purely military solution. Some recognized that winning the war required winning over the Filipino population, not just defeating Filipino soldiers. General Arthur MacArthur, who replaced Otis as military governor in May of 1900, tried to implement what he called a policy of attraction and chastisement. The idea was to use both the carrot and the stick, reward Filipinos who accepted American rule, and punish those who resisted. The attraction part involved building schools, roads, and other infrastructure. It involved providing medical care and vaccinations. It involved establishing a court system and local governments. It involved promising that once the Philippines was pacified, Filipinos would be given increasing self-government. MacArthur genuinely believed in the benevolent aspects of American rule. He saw himself as bringing civilization, education, and modern government to a people who, in his view, had been oppressed by Spain and were now being misled by Aguinaldo and other revolutionaries. The chastisement part involved military operations against guerrillas and increasingly harsh measures against civilians who supported them. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned. Crops were destroyed to deny food to guerrilla forces. Prisoners were interrogated using harsh methods, including the infamous water cure. The water cure was a torture technique where a prisoner would be held down, a cloth placed over their face, and water poured over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning. Sound familiar? This is essentially the same technique that would later be called waterboarding. American soldiers used it to extract information about guerrilla activities and locations. In July of 1900, the civilian dimension of American rule was strengthened with the arrival of William Howard Taft as head of the new Philippine Commission. Taft would later become President of the United States, but in 1900, he was a federal judge from Ohio with no experience in colonial administration or the Philippines. Taft arrived with a mission to establish civil government and win the support of educated Filipinos. He famously declared that American policy was the Philippines for the Filipinos, but of course, under American sovereignty and guidance. Taft understood that the guerrilla war couldn't be won by military force alone. He needed to separate the insurgents from potential supporters particularly among the Filipino elite, the Ilustrados. Many of these educated Filipinos had initially supported Aguinaldo but were having second thoughts. The war was disrupting their businesses, threatening their property, and creating instability. Taft reached out to this group. He promised them positions in the American colonial government. He promised that their property rights would be respected. He promised that Americans would build schools and infrastructure. He promised that Filipinos would eventually get self-government, though he wasn't specific about when. This strategy had some success. Prominent Filipinos began to accept positions in the American colonial government. Some former revolutionaries switched sides. The Ilustrados, who had wealth and education to protect, increasingly saw accommodation with American rule as preferable to continued war. This was devastating to the revolutionary cause. Aguinaldo's movement had always depended on support from the educated elite. When that support began to erode, it became harder to maintain legitimacy, harder to organize resistance, and harder to convince ordinary Filipinos that independence was achievable. But even as some Filipinos were being won over by American promises, the guerrilla war was intensifying, and American forces were about to get a break that would change the character of the war. By early 1901, Aguinaldo had been on the run for nearly 2 years. He had moved his headquarters repeatedly, always staying one step ahead of American forces. He was operating out of Palanan, a remote town on the eastern coast of Luzon, accessible only by difficult mountain trails or by sea. American commanders desperately wanted to capture Aguinaldo. They believed correctly that his capture would be a major psychological blow to the insurgency. But finding him was difficult. He was protected by loyal forces, warned in advance of American movements by the intelligence network, and operating in terrain that heavily favored the defender. Then an American general named Frederick Funston came up with an audacious plan. Funston was a young, ambitious officer who had distinguished himself in the fighting. He wasn't a West Point graduate or a traditional military man. He had been a journalist and adventurer before the war. This unconventional background helped him think creatively about how to capture Aguinaldo. Funston's plan involved an elaborate deception. He would use captured Filipino soldiers who had agreed to cooperate, along with a group of Macabebe scouts, Filipinos from Pampanga who had fought on the American side throughout the war. These men would pretend to be guerrillas bringing American prisoners, Funston, and a few other American officers, to Aguinaldo as captives. The deception required careful preparation. They needed authentic-looking documents, including a forged letter supposedly from a guerrilla commander saying he was sending prisoners and reinforcements. They needed to coach the Macabebe scouts on what to say, and they needed to get to Palanan without raising suspicion. In March of 1901, the expedition set out. They traveled by ship to a point on the coast, then made the difficult trek inland through jungle and mountains. The journey took days of hard marching. They needed to avoid genuine guerrilla forces who might expose the deception. They had to maintain their cover story at all times. On March 23, 1901, they arrived at Palanan. The guerrilla guards, seeing what they believed were fellow revolutionaries bringing American prisoners, welcomed them. Aguinaldo himself came out to greet what he thought were reinforcements. At the last moment, Funston and the Macabebe scouts revealed their true identities and captured Aguinaldo and his staff. There was brief confusion and some shooting, but Aguinaldo was quickly secured. The whole operation had succeeded with minimal casualties. The capture was a sensation. Funston became a national hero in the United States. Newspapers ran triumphant stories about the daring raid. It seemed like the war might finally be over. Aguinaldo was brought to Manila, and after a brief period of detention, took an oath of allegiance to the United States. He then issued a proclamation calling on Filipinos to lay down their arms and accept American sovereignty. He argued that continued resistance was futile and would only bring more suffering. Some revolutionaries did surrender after Aguinaldo's capture and proclamation. Thousands laid down their weapons and accepted amnesty. American authorities claimed that the insurrection was essentially over, but they were wrong. While Aguinaldo had been the symbolic leader of the revolution, the movement had become decentralized. Regional commanders were operating independently, and many of these commanders saw Aguinaldo's surrender as a betrayal. They vowed to fight on. The war would continue, and it would get worse. Despite Aguinaldo's capture, significant resistance continued, especially in the Tagalog provinces south of Manila and on the island of Samar. Regional commanders like General Miguel Malvar in Batangas and General Vicente Lucban on Samar refused to surrender. These commanders understood that they couldn't defeat the Americans militarily, but they could make the occupation so costly that the Americans might eventually leave. The guerrilla war intensified. American casualties from ambushes and raids mounted. The frustration among American forces grew. Then, on September 28, 1901, an event occurred that would provoke one of the most brutal American campaigns of the entire war. On that date, Company C of the 9th U.S. Infantry Regiment was stationed in the town of Balangiga on Samar Island. The company had about 74 men. The town seemed peaceful. The local police chief and other officials seemed cooperative. The Americans felt relatively safe. At breakfast time on September 28, church bells rang, a normal sound. But this was a signal. Hundreds of Filipino fighters, disguised as townspeople, attacked the American garrison. They used bolos, machetes, and captured American weapons. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. In the fighting that followed, 48 American soldiers were killed, most hacked to death with bolos. 22 were wounded, some horribly. Only a handful escaped uninjured. It was the worst defeat of American forces in a single action during the entire war. The survivors retreated to the beach and were eventually rescued by another American unit, but the psychological impact of the Balangiga massacre, as Americans called it, was enormous. The idea that peaceful townspeople could suddenly turn into killers shocked and horrified American forces and the American public. Brigadier General Jacob H. Smith was given command of operations on Samar with orders to pacify the island and punish those responsible for the massacre. Smith, who was 61 years old and nearing retirement, was known for his harsh views on warfare. What he did next would become one of the most controversial episodes of the war. Smith's orders to his subordinate, Major Littleton Waller, were explicit and brutal. According to Waller's later testimony, Smith told him, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me." When Waller asked about the age limit for killing, Smith allegedly replied, 10 years old. The idea was that anyone over 10 could be a potential enemy and should be killed. These orders were carried out with ruthless efficiency. American forces on Samar burned villages, killed livestock, destroyed crops, and killed Filipinos suspected of supporting the insurgents. The island was devastated. Smith later boasted that he wanted to turn Samar into a howling wilderness. The Samar campaign was effective in military terms. It destroyed the insurgent infrastructure on the island, but it was a moral disaster. When news of Smith's orders and the conduct of the campaign leaked out, it caused a scandal in the United States. Smith was eventually court-martialed, not for his actions in Samar, but for his orders to kill all males over 10. He was found guilty and sentenced to be admonished. That was it, just admonished. He was allowed to retire at his full rank and pension. The light punishment sent a message. Extreme measures against Filipino civilians would be tolerated. The Samar campaign was just one example of the increasingly harsh tactics being used throughout the Philippines. Another American commander who would employ harsh tactics was General J. Franklin Bell. Bell was put in command of operations in Batangas province, south of Manila, where General Miguel Malvar led a stubborn and effective guerrilla resistance. Bell studied the situation and concluded that the guerrillas couldn't survive without support from the civilian population. They needed civilians to provide food, shelter, information, and recruits. If you could separate the guerrillas from the civilians, the guerrillas would wither away. Bell's solution was reconcentration. This was the same tactic that the Spanish had used in Cuba, the tactic that had horrified Americans and helped trigger the Spanish-American War. Now, Americans were using it in the Philippines. Bell's orders, issued in December of 1901, required all civilians in certain areas to move into designated zones near American garrisons. These zones were essentially concentration camps, though they weren't initially called that. Anyone found outside these zones would be presumed to be an insurgent and could be shot on sight. The impact was devastating. Thousands of Filipinos were forced to abandon their homes, their farms, and their livelihoods and move into overcrowded camps. The camps quickly became death traps. Sanitation was poor, food was scarce, disease spread rapidly. Cholera, dysentery, and malaria killed thousands. Bell's forces also destroyed everything outside the concentration zones. Crops were burned, houses were razed, livestock was killed or confiscated. The idea was to create a wasteland where guerrillas couldn't survive. If guerrillas tried to operate in these areas, they would have no food, no shelter, and no support. The strategy worked in purely military terms. Cut off from civilian support and facing starvation, many guerrilla fighters surrendered or died. Malvar himself would eventually surrender in April of 1902. But the human cost was staggering. We don't have exact figures for how many civilians died in the reconcentration camps and from the destruction of the countryside, but estimates run from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Some historians estimate that the total Filipino death toll from the war, including civilians who died from disease and starvation, could be as high as 1 million, out of a total population of about 7 million. Let's pause for a moment to really understand what this means. Imagine a modern country losing 1/7 of its entire population in the space of 3 years. Imagine entire provinces where the population declined by 90%. Imagine villages where everyone you knew, your family, your friends, your neighbors, was dead or displaced. The experience of Filipino civilians during this war was one of unimaginable suffering. For many, the war came suddenly and without warning. One day you're working in your rice paddy, living your life, raising your children. The next day, soldiers arrive, either American or Filipino guerrillas, and demand food, information, or labor. Refuse, and you might be killed as an enemy. Cooperate, and the other side might kill you as a collaborator. Families were torn apart. Men were conscripted by both sides. The Americans wanted labor and guides. The guerrillas wanted fighters and supplies. Women and children were left to manage alone or were forcibly relocated to concentration camps. The elderly and the sick, who couldn't flee or adapt, died in large numbers. The reconcentration zones were nightmares. Imagine being forced to leave your home with only what you can carry. You're marched to a zone near an American garrison and told to build a new shelter. But there's not enough materials. Everyone is competing for the same bamboo and nipa palm. There's not enough food. The Americans provide some rations, but not enough, and you can't farm because the fields are outside the zone. There's no sanitation system, so waste accumulates and disease spreads. In these camps, cholera was the biggest killer. Cholera is a waterborne disease that causes severe diarrhea and dehydration. Without proper sanitation and clean water, it spreads rapidly. People would get sick in the morning and be dead by evening. Entire families would be wiped out in a week. The bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried. Malaria was another killer, spread by mosquitoes that bred in standing water around the camps. Dysentery, typhoid, beriberi, and other diseases also ravaged the overcrowded camps. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Many children lost their parents and became orphans, left to fend for themselves or taken in by strangers who were themselves barely surviving. Starvation was also common. With the crops burned and the livestock killed, there simply wasn't enough food. The Americans provided some rations, but never enough. People ate anything they could find: grass, bark, insects. Malnutrition made people more vulnerable to disease, creating a vicious cycle. Women faced particular horrors. Sexual violence was common, both from soldiers and from desperate civilians. Women had to make impossible choices to protect themselves and their children. The historical record is mostly silent about these crimes, but we know from similar conflicts that they happened. And then there was the psychological trauma. Imagine watching your village burned, your neighbors killed, your family scattered. Imagine living in constant fear, never knowing if today would be the day soldiers came to take you away. Imagine the survivor's guilt of living when so many others died. This trauma affected an entire generation of Filipinos, though we have few first-hand accounts because most victims were illiterate and left no written record. Some Filipinos managed to survive by collaborating with the Americans, by working as guides, translators, or laborers. This was a survival strategy, but it came with its own risks. The guerrillas saw collaborators as traitors and would execute them if given the chance. Families were divided between those who collaborated and those who resisted, creating enmities that lasted for generations. The Catholic Church played a complicated role. Spanish friars generally opposed Filipino independence and often supported the Americans. Filipino priests sometimes supported the revolution. Churches were sometimes used as hospitals or fortifications. The religious dimension of people's lives, which was central in this deeply Catholic country, became another battleground. Think about that for a moment. 1 in 7 Filipinos may have died as a direct or indirect result of this war. That's equivalent to roughly 47 million Americans dying today. It would be one of the greatest demographic catastrophes of the early 20th century, yet it's barely remembered in American history. The reconcentration campaign also involved the systematic use of torture to extract information. The water cure became common. Prisoners would be tortured to reveal the locations of guerrilla forces, weapons caches, and food supplies. Some American soldiers wrote home about these practices. Some expressed regret. Others defended them as necessary to fight an enemy who didn't wear uniforms and hid among civilians. In February of 1902, news of the water cure and other tortures began to appear in American newspapers. The anti-imperialist press, particularly papers opposed to the McKinley administration, published letters from soldiers describing these practices. The stories caused a public outcry. The U.S. Senate launched an investigation in January of 1902. The Senate Committee on the Philippines, chaired by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, held hearings about the conduct of the war. Soldiers testified about the water cure, the burning of villages, the killing of prisoners, and the harsh treatment of civilians. The hearings revealed deeply disturbing conduct, but they also showed how some Americans justified these actions. Supporters of the war argued that Filipino insurgents didn't fight by civilized rules. They wore no uniforms, they hid among civilians, they killed American prisoners, so American forces couldn't be expected to follow conventional rules of warfare either. Moreover, many Americans simply didn't care that much about Filipino suffering. This was an era of widespread racism. Many Americans viewed Filipinos as racially inferior and thus less deserving of humane treatment. If harsh methods were needed to civilize and control these people, so be it. The Roosevelt administration, Theodore Roosevelt, had become president in September of 1901 after McKinley was assassinated, worked to limit the political damage from the torture scandal. Some officers were court-martialed, but punishments were generally light. The official line was that these were isolated incidents, not systematic policy, and that American rule was overall beneficial for the Filipinos. By the spring of 1902, the organized resistance was crumbling. General Malvar surrendered in April, as mentioned. Other commanders followed. Aguinaldo, from his comfortable exile in Manila, continued to call for Filipinos to accept American rule. On July 4, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt issued a proclamation declaring the Philippine insurrection over and granting amnesty to rebels who surrendered. July 4th was deliberately chosen Independence Day. The symbolism was clear. The war for Philippine independence had failed. American sovereignty was established. But was the war really over? In most of the Philippines, yes. Organized resistance in the Christian-majority lowlands had largely ended. American civil government was being established. Schools were being built. Infrastructure was being developed. Thousands of American teachers, nicknamed Thomasites, after the ship Thomas that brought many of them, were arriving to set up an American-style education system. Many Filipinos, exhausted by 3 years of war, accepted the new reality. They enrolled their children in American schools. They participated in the new local governments. They tried to rebuild their lives and their communities. But in the Muslim South, in Mindanao, Sulu, and other islands, the war was far from over. The Moros, as Spanish and Americans called the Muslim Filipinos, had a different history and different relationship with the colonial powers. The Moros had been resisting outside control for centuries. When the Spanish arrived in the Philippines in the 1500s, they found the Muslim sultanates of Mindanao and Sulu already well established. The Spanish spent 300 years trying to conquer these sultanates and never fully succeeded. The Moros had their own political structures, sultanates with sultans, datas, and a system of Islamic law. They had their own culture, distinct from the Christian Filipinos of the north. They had their own traditions of warfare, including the practice of juramentado, a form of religiously motivated suicide attack where a warrior would take an oath to kill as many enemies as possible before being killed himself. Understanding Moro culture is essential to understanding why they resisted so fiercely and why the conflict was so difficult for the Americans. The Moros weren't a single unified group. They included various ethnic groups, Tausug, Maguindanao, Maranao, Samal, and others, each with their own traditions and political structures. What united them was Islam, brought to the southern Philippines by Arab and Malay traders centuries before the Spanish arrived. Islam wasn't just a religion for the Moros, it was the foundation of their entire social and political order. Islamic law governed everything from property rights to marriage to criminal justice. The sultans and datas derived their authority partly from their role as defenders and interpreters of Islamic law. An attack on Moro political authority was also an attack on Islam itself. The Moros had a warrior culture that valued courage, honor, and resistance to outside domination. Men were expected to be proficient with weapons, the kris sword, the spear, and later firearms. Physical courage was the highest virtue. Dying in battle, especially in defense of Islam, was seen as honorable and guaranteed paradise in the afterlife. This helps explain the juramentado tradition. A man would take an oath, often in a mosque ceremony, to sacrifice himself by killing as many enemies as possible before dying. He would prepare himself spiritually through prayer and ritual. He would sometimes bind his body tightly to reduce bleeding if wounded. Then he would attack, usually with a kris sword, striking down as many enemies as he could before being killed. From the Moro perspective, this was a noble act of religious devotion and resistance. From the American perspective, it was terrorism or fanaticism. This cultural gap made the conflict particularly bitter and difficult to resolve. The Moro economy was based on agriculture, fishing, trade, and historically also on raiding and slavery. The slave trade was particularly important. Moros would raid coastal areas, taking captives who would be sold as slaves or used as labor. This practice horrified the Americans and the Spanish before them, though, of course, Americans had their own recent history with slavery. Moro society was hierarchical. At the top were the sultans and datas, hereditary nobility who controlled land and people. Below them were free people, farmers, fishermen, traders, craftsmen. At the bottom were slaves. American attempts to abolish slavery and disrupt this social hierarchy threatened the power base of the Moro leadership. Women in Moro society had a complex status. They were expected to be modest and often secluded, especially among the upper classes. But they also had property rights and could inherit and own land. In some cases, they could exercise considerable power through their husbands or sons. American attempts to change Moro customs regarding women created additional friction. The geographic setting of Moro land also shaped the conflict. Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago are characterized by dense jungles, high mountains, and countless islands. This terrain favored defenders and made it extremely difficult for outsiders to conquer and hold territory. The Moros knew every trail, every hidden cove, every mountain pass. The Americans were operating in unfamiliar and hostile terrain. The Moros also had an extensive trading network that brought them weapons and supplies. They traded with Borneo, with other parts of Southeast Asia, and sometimes with European or American merchants. This gave them access to modern firearms, though never enough to match American firepower. When the Americans arrived, they initially tried to co-opt rather than conquer the Moros. In August of 1899, General John Bates negotiated a treaty with the Sultan of Sulu. The Bates Treaty recognized the Sultan's authority in internal matters while asserting American sovereignty over the Sulu archipelago. In exchange, the Sultan would stop piracy and slave raiding. This arrangement was never going to last. The Americans wanted complete control, not a power-sharing arrangement with a sultan, and many Moros weren't willing to accept American sovereignty at all. They had fought the Spanish for 3 centuries. They weren't going to simply submit to a new colonial power. Moreover, the Americans fundamentally misunderstood Moro political structure. They thought they could make a deal with the Sultan and the whole population would follow. But the Sultan's actual authority was limited. Individual datus controlled their own territories and people. The Sultan couldn't force them to accept American rule, and many chose to resist. As American control tightened in the Christian North, American attention turned to the Muslim South. In 1903, the American government abrogated the Bates Treaty and began asserting direct control over Moro territories. American forces began disarming Moro communities, interfering in local governance, and generally treating the Moros as subjects rather than allies. This violated everything the Moros valued. They were being told to give up their weapons, which was both practically dangerous and culturally humiliating. They were being told to abandon slavery, which disrupted their economy and social structure. They were being told to accept American law over Islamic law. They were being told to submit to foreign rule. The Moros resisted. The resistance took various forms, from full-scale battles to individual juramentado attacks on American soldiers. The conflict in Moroland, as Americans called it, was different from the war in the Christian North. This wasn't primarily a guerrilla war. The Moros often fought in the open, defending fortified positions called cotas. They didn't blend into the civilian population the way the guerrillas in the North had. They fought more conventionally, though with tremendous bravery and religious fervor. American forces had overwhelming firepower, artillery, modern rifles, and machine guns. Moro fighters had courage, faith, kris swords, and spears supplemented with some firearms. The result was often one-sided massacres, though the Moros inflicted casualties despite being hugely outmatched. The most infamous engagement was the First Battle of Bud Daho in March of 1906. Bud Daho is a volcanic crater on the island of Jolo. Several hundred Moros men, women, and children took refuge in the crater, preparing to resist American forces. The Moros had fortified the crater, but they were trapped. American forces surrounded the crater and, on March 5, began their assault. They used artillery to bombard the Moro positions, then sent infantry to assault up the slopes. The fighting lasted 3 days. The Moros resisted fiercely, even desperately. Women fought alongside men. Even children were armed. The Americans had overwhelming advantages in numbers and firepower, but the Moros fought to the death. By March 7, the battle was over. According to American reports, between 600 and 900 Moros were killed, including women and children. Only 21 survived. American casualties were 21 killed and 75 wounded. Was this a battle or a massacre? American military authorities called it a legitimate military operation against hostile forces. Critics, including Mark Twain, called it a massacre of innocents. Twain wrote a scathing satire suggesting that Americans should amend their flag, replacing the stars with skulls and crossbones and the stripes with stripes of black for mourning. The Bud Dajo affair caused controversy in the United States, but it didn't fundamentally change American policy in the Philippines. The fighting in Moroland continued. Another major engagement occurred at Bud Bagsak in June of 1913. This was similar to Bud Dajo. Moro fighters and their families took refuge in a fortified position. American forces surrounded and assaulted them, and the result was another one-sided slaughter. The American commander at Bud Bagsak was General John J. Pershing, who would later command American forces in World War I. Pershing had been fighting in the Philippines since the beginning of the war and had developed a reputation as an effective but harsh commander in dealing with the Moros. The Battle of Bud Bagsak marked the end of major organized Moro resistance. After 1913, the fighting largely subsided. The Moros hadn't been defeated in the sense of accepting American rule willingly, but they had been forced to accept it as a practical reality. The conflict with the Moros had one interesting technological consequence. American soldiers found that their standard-issue .38 caliber revolvers lacked sufficient stopping power against juramentado warriors who were often drugged, in religious frenzy, and determined to kill before dying. A Moro warrior could be shot multiple times with a .38 and keep fighting long enough to kill American soldiers with his kris. This led the U.S. military to develop and adopt the .45 caliber pistol, specifically the M1911 pistol designed by John Browning. The larger, more powerful .45 round could stop even a determined attacker with a single shot. The M1911 would become one of the most iconic American firearms, serving as the standard U.S. military sidearm until the 1980s. Its origin was in the jungles and mountains of the Philippines, where American soldiers desperately needed a weapon that could stop Moro warriors. With the fighting largely over by 1913, we can look at what American colonial rule actually meant for the Philippines. The legal framework was established by the Philippine Organic Act of 1902, also known as the Philippine Bill. This act established the Philippines as an unincorporated territory of the United States, meaning it was controlled by the U.S. but not destined to become a state. The act established a civil government with a governor-general appointed by the U.S. president and a Philippine commission that functioned as a legislature. The first civilian governor-general was William Howard Taft, who served from 1901 to 1904 before being called back to Washington to serve in Theodore Roosevelt's cabinet. Taft genuinely believed in a benevolent American mission in the Philippines. He wanted to build infrastructure, establish good government, provide education, and gradually prepare Filipinos for self-government. The American colonial government did build a lot. Roads were constructed, bridges were built, a modern sanitation system was established in Manila and other cities, hospitals were opened, a public education system was created. That education system deserves special attention because it was a key tool of Americanization. The colonial government recruited American teachers, the Thomasites and others who followed, to establish schools throughout the Philippines. English was made the language of instruction. Filipino children learned American history alongside or instead of their own history. They learned about Washington and Lincoln, about American democracy and values. The education system was remarkably successful in spreading English. Within a generation, English became the language of government, business, and educated discourse in the Philippines. This had profound effects on Philippine culture and society, some positive and some problematic. The economic changes under American rule were also significant. The Philippines was integrated into the American economic system. Philippine products, sugar, hemp, tobacco, coconut products entered the U.S. market duty-free. American products flowed into the Philippines. American businesses invested in Philippine plantations, mines, and infrastructure. This created economic growth and modernization, but it also created dependency. The Philippine economy became oriented toward exporting raw materials to the United States and importing manufactured goods. This pattern would create problems later, after independence, when the Philippines tried to develop a more balanced economy. Politically, the Americans did gradually allow more Filipino participation in government. The Philippine Assembly was established in 1907, providing a degree of elected representation. Filipinos increasingly filled positions in the colonial bureaucracy. By the 1920s, Filipinos held most government positions, except the very top ones. In 1916, the Jones Act promised eventual independence for the Philippines, though it didn't set a specific date. This promise helped reduce Filipino nationalist opposition to American rule. If independence was coming eventually, why fight for it now? Still, there was ongoing resistance to American rule, even if it wasn't armed resistance. Filipino nationalists continued to push for independence. They formed political parties, published newspapers, and lobbied in Washington. Leaders like Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña advocated for Filipino interests while working within the American colonial system. The Philippine experience under American colonial rule is complicated. The Americans did bring some benefits: infrastructure, education, public health improvements, and a promise of eventual independence. They didn't extract resources as brutally as some European colonial powers did in their colonies. But it was still colonialism. Filipinos didn't choose American rule. Hundreds of thousands died in the war that established that rule, and the entire colonial project was based on a racist assumption that Filipinos weren't capable of governing themselves and needed American tutelage. Let's talk numbers. How much did this war cost in lives and treasure? American military casualties were approximately 4,200 killed. Of these, only about 1,000 died in combat. The rest, roughly 3,200, died from disease. 20,000 Americans were wounded. Filipino military casualties are harder to determine precisely, but estimates are around 20,000 killed in combat. But those numbers don't capture the full cost. The civilian death toll was catastrophic. This is where the numbers get really contested. Conservative estimates put Filipino civilian deaths at around 200,000. Higher estimates go up to 1 million. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but even the conservative estimate is staggering. How did so many civilians die? Disease and starvation caused by the war. The reconcentration camps were where disease ran rampant. The destruction of crops and livestock that led to famine. Cholera epidemics that spread through displaced populations. The general breakdown of society that accompanies prolonged warfare. In some provinces, like Batangas, the population declined by as much as 90% during the war. Entire villages were wiped out. Families were destroyed. The social fabric was torn apart. The economic cost was also immense. For the Americans, the war cost approximately $400 million, a huge sum for the time, equivalent to tens of billions in today's money. This doesn't count the ongoing costs of colonial administration, which continued for decades. For the Filipinos, the economic cost is incalculable. Farmland was destroyed, infrastructure was wrecked, commerce was disrupted. A generation of young men who should have been building the economy were dead or traumatized. The war set back Philippine economic development by decades. There was also a moral cost. American soldiers had committed atrocities, torture, massacres, destruction of civilian property. Some soldiers were troubled by what they had done and seen. Some suffered what we would today recognize as PTSD, though it wasn't understood or treated at the time. And there was a cost to American ideals. The United States had fought a war to deny people their independence, had used harsh tactics that included torture and concentration camps, and had done all this while claiming to be bringing civilization and democracy. This contradiction would haunt American foreign policy for generations. The anti-imperialist movement in the United States tried to make the war and its atrocities a major political issue. The Anti-Imperialist League published articles, held rallies, and lobbied Congress. Mark Twain wrote devastating satires. Andrew Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines from the government and give them their independence. The Senate investigation in 1902 did expose some of the brutality of the war. Officers testified about the water cure and other harsh tactics. The hearings were covered in newspapers, some Americans were genuinely disturbed by what they learned. General Jacob Smith was court-martialed for his orders in Samar to kill all males over 10. The court-martial was widely publicized, but Smith was only admonished and allowed to retire at full rank. The light punishment suggested that the army didn't really consider his actions to be serious crimes. A few other officers were court-martialed for specific atrocities, but again, punishments were generally light. The message was clear. The American military and government would tolerate harsh measures in prosecuting the war. The Roosevelt administration worked to manage the scandal. Theodore Roosevelt was a strong supporter of American imperialism and wasn't going to let the torture scandal derail American policy in the Philippines. His administration emphasized the progressive aspects of American rule, the schools, the infrastructure, the promise of eventual self-government. They downplayed the atrocities as isolated incidents. This strategy largely worked. By 1903, the torture scandal had faded from the headlines. The anti-imperialist movement lost momentum. Most Americans lost interest in the Philippines and moved on to other concerns. Why did the anti-imperialist movement fail to stop the war or fundamentally change American policy? Several reasons. First, the American military victories, particularly the capture of Aguinaldo, created the perception that the war was won. Why keep debating a war that was essentially over? Second, racism played a role. Many Americans simply didn't care that much about Filipino suffering because they didn't view Filipinos as equals deserving of the same rights as white Americans. Third, economic interests supported American rule. Businesses that had invested in the Philippines, exporters who wanted access to Asian markets, and naval strategists who wanted Pacific bases all lobbied for maintaining American control. Fourth, the promise of eventual independence took the wind out of the sails of some critics. If America was going to give the Philippines independence eventually, wasn't American colonial rule acceptable in the meantime? And fifth, there were other issues competing for public attention. The progressive era was in full swing with debates about labor rights, trust busting, conservation, and other domestic issues. Most Americans cared more about those issues than about a distant colony. The Philippine-American War essentially disappeared from American consciousness. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't commemorated with monuments. Veterans didn't talk about it much. It became, in the words of historian Stanley Carnot, America's forgotten war. For Filipinos, of course, the war was far from forgotten. It was a defining moment in their history, though the meaning of that moment was contested. Emilio Aguinaldo lived until 1964. He was 94 years old when he died. His legacy in the Philippines is complicated. He's honored as a revolutionary hero who declared Philippine independence and fought against American imperialism. Schools are named after him. There's a province named after him. His birthday is celebrated. But there are also criticisms. Some see his surrender and oath of allegiance to the United States as a betrayal. Others point to his role in the deaths of Bonifacio and Luna as evidence of his willingness to eliminate rivals. Some argue that his military strategy was flawed and that better leadership might have achieved a different outcome. The broader question for Filipinos was, what if independence had been granted in 1898 or 1899? Would the Philippines have been better off? Supporters of American rule argued that the Philippines wasn't ready for independence in 1898. The country was fragmented, with different regions, ethnic groups, and languages. There was no strong national identity yet. There were limited educated elites capable of running a modern government. Without American guidance, they argued, the Philippines would have collapsed into chaos or been conquered by another power. Critics of American rule argued that these problems could have been worked out by Filipinos themselves. Other countries had achieved independence, despite similar challenges. The Philippines had educated leaders like Aguinaldo, Mabini, Luna, and others who were capable of governing. American rule, they argued, was unnecessary and destructive. The counterfactual is impossible to prove either way. We don't know what would have happened if the Philippines had been granted independence in 1898. We do know what did happen: American colonial rule lasting until 1946, Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945, and then finally independence. One interesting aspect of the Philippine-American relationship is that many Filipinos fought for the United States in subsequent conflicts. Filipino soldiers served in World War I. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos fought alongside Americans against the Japanese. The relationship between the Philippines and the United States, despite the brutal war of 1899 to 1902, became close in many ways. This is partly because of cultural influence. Decades of American colonial rule, American education, American media, and American economic ties created deep connections. English became a widely spoken language. American culture was adopted and adapted. Many Filipinos immigrated to the United States, creating a large Filipino-American community. But the memory of the war and the occupation never entirely disappeared. Filipino nationalists continued to criticize American imperialism. The presence of American military bases in the Philippines after independence was controversial. When those bases finally closed in the early 1990s, it was seen by many Filipinos as finally achieving full independence. The Philippine-American War set precedents that would shape American foreign policy for the next century. First, it established the template for American counterinsurgency warfare. The problems American forces faced in the Philippines: distinguishing combatants from civilians, gathering intelligence in a hostile environment, fighting an enemy who wouldn't stand and fight, would reappear in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts. Some of the tactics used in the Philippines, population control, winning hearts and minds, using local allies, harsh interrogation methods, would also reappear. The lessons learned in the Philippines, both positive and negative, would influence American military doctrine for generations. Second, it demonstrated that the United States was willing to use force to establish and maintain overseas control. The Philippines wouldn't be the only place where American forces would fight to impose American will. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, American forces would intervene in Cuba, Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico. The pattern was established in the Philippines. Third, it showed the contradiction at the heart of American imperialism. The United States claimed to be different from European colonial powers, claimed to be bringing democracy and freedom, claimed to be preparing colonies for eventual independence. But when faced with resistance, American forces used tactics, concentration camps, torture, collective punishment that were indistinguishable from those of other colonial powers. This contradiction created cognitive dissonance. Americans wanted to believe they were the good guys, bringing civilization to the world. The reality of counterinsurgency warfare in the Philippines challenged that self-image. The resolution was often to either deny the atrocities happened, minimize their significance, or claim they were necessary aberrations in an otherwise noble mission. Fourth, the war established the United States as a Pacific power. American control of the Philippines gave the U.S. a major base in Asia. This influenced American involvement in Asian affairs throughout the 20th century. It was a factor in U.S.-Japan relations that would eventually lead to World War II. It influenced American policy toward China. It established America's role as a Pacific power that would continue through the Cold War and beyond. The Philippine experience also directly influenced the men who would lead America into the 20th century. Many of the officers who fought in the Philippines would go on to senior positions. Douglas MacArthur, whose father, Arthur MacArthur, was military governor of the Philippines, would himself return to the Philippines during World War II and play a key role in the Pacific War. General John Pershing, who fought the Moros, would command American forces in World War I. Many of the soldiers who fought in the Philippines would serve again in World War I, bringing with them the lessons of counterinsurgency warfare. Even the political leaders were shaped by the Philippine experience. William Howard Taft went from being governor of the Philippines to being Secretary of War to being president. Theodore Roosevelt's aggressive foreign policy as president was consistent with his support for taking the Philippines. The networks of American colonial administrators, businessmen, teachers, and military officers who served in the Philippines created an old Philippines hand community that influenced American policy toward the islands for decades. The Philippine-American War matters. It matters not just as a historical event, but as a lens through which we can understand American power, American imperialism, and the contradictions in American identity. This was the war that transformed the United States from a continental republic into a global empire. It was the first time America fought a sustained counterinsurgency war on the other side of the world. It was the first time American forces occupied and governed a large non-white population that didn't want to be governed by America. The war raised fundamental questions about American values and American power. Could a nation founded on the principle of self-government justify denying self-government to others? Could a nation that prided itself on freedom and democracy reconcile that with ruling over people who explicitly rejected American rule? Could America be an empire and still be America? These questions were debated intensely in the early 1900s, but they were never fully resolved. Instead, they were papered over with a narrative about America's civilizing mission, about preparing the Philippines for eventual independence, and about the benevolent nature of American rule. That narrative contained some truth. American colonial rule did bring some benefits to the Philippines, but it also obscured the violence, the exploitation, and the fundamental injustice of imperial rule. It allowed Americans to feel good about empire without confronting the contradictions empire created. The war also demonstrated the costs of empire, both for the colonized and the colonizer. For Filipinos, the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead, their independence denied, their country occupied. For Americans, the cost was measured not just in the thousands of soldiers who died, but in the moral compromise of using torture, concentration camps, and collective punishment while claiming to spread democracy and civilization. Perhaps most importantly, the Philippine-American War established patterns that would repeat throughout the 20th century. The difficulty of fighting insurgencies, the temptation to use harsh tactics when conventional warfare failed, the tendency to underestimate nationalist movements, the gap between America's ideals and America's actions, all of these would appear again in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. If we had paid more attention to the Philippine-American War, if we had grappled more honestly with its lessons, perhaps we might have avoided some of the mistakes that came later. But because the war was forgotten, its lessons were lost, and each new generation had to relearn them painfully. The war also reveals something important about historical memory. In the Philippines, the war and the revolution that preceded it are central to national identity. They're taught in schools, commemorated in monuments, remembered in national holidays. Filipino children learn about Aguinaldo, Bonifacio, Luna, and the struggle for independence. In the United States, the war has been largely erased from popular memory. Most Americans have never heard of it. It's a footnote in textbooks, if it appears at all. This erasure is not accidental. It's the result of a deliberate choice to forget an episode that doesn't fit comfortably with American narratives about spreading freedom and democracy. But history that's forgotten doesn't disappear. It shapes the present in ways we don't always recognize. The patterns established in the Philippines, the belief that American military power can reshape societies, the confidence that American values are universal and should be spread globally, the willingness to use harsh tactics when met with resistance, these patterns persist. Understanding the Philippine-American War helps us understand American power in the world. It helps us see the gap between American ideals and American actions. It helps us recognize that American interventions, however well-intentioned, often have devastating consequences for the people who are supposed to be helped. The war also offers a more complete picture of American history. Too often, American history is taught as a story of continuous progress toward greater freedom and democracy. The Philippine-American War complicates that narrative. It shows that American expansion wasn't always welcomed. It shows that American power wasn't always benevolent. It shows that the spread of American influence came at a terrible cost for many people. For those interested in military history, the war is fascinating as a case study in counterinsurgency warfare. The challenges American forces faced, distinguishing combatants from civilians, gathering reliable intelligence, fighting an enemy who controlled the population, are the same challenges that have appeared in every counterinsurgency since. The solutions attempted population control, civic action, local allies, harsh interrogation, are also familiar from later conflicts. For those interested in the history of torture and international law, the Philippine-American War is significant. The water cure scandal was one of the first major controversies about American torture. The debates about whether harsh interrogation was justified in fighting an irregular enemy presaged similar debates a century later about waterboarding and enhanced interrogation techniques. For those interested in the history of race and racism, the war reveals the deep racism that undergirded American imperialism. The casual use of racial slurs by American soldiers, the assumption that non-white peoples were incapable of self-government, the dehumanization that made atrocities possible. All of this was enabled by the racism of the era. For those interested in the history of anti-imperialism and peace movements, the Anti-Imperialist League and figures like Mark Twain offer inspiring examples of Americans who stood up against empire even when it was unpopular to do so. They lost the political battle, but their moral witness remains important. The Philippine-American War doesn't fit neatly into simple narratives of good versus evil. The Filipinos fighting for independence were heroes in many ways, but the revolutionary movement also had internal conflicts, assassinations, and its own atrocities. The Americans believed they were bringing civilization and eventual self-government, but they used brutal tactics and denied Filipinos the very freedom they claimed to champion. This moral complexity is part of why the war is important to study. Easy narratives, America the Liberator, America the Civilizer, America the Beacon of Freedom, fall apart when confronted with the reality of the war in the Philippines. We're forced to grapple with a more complex truth, that America has done both great good and great harm in the world, sometimes simultaneously. What would have happened if the United States had granted the Philippines independence in 1898, as Aguinaldo and many Filipinos wanted? We'll never know. Perhaps the Philippines would have struggled with internal divisions and economic challenges. Perhaps another power would have intervened. Perhaps the Filipinos would have worked out their challenges and built a stable, independent nation. What we do know is what actually happened. A brutal 3-year war followed by 4 decades of colonial rule, followed by 3 years of Japanese occupation, followed finally by independence in 1946, nearly half a century after Aguinaldo declared independence on that balcony in Cavite. The roads not taken in history are always tempting to explore, but ultimately we must deal with the history that actually occurred. And that history includes a war that most Americans have forgotten, but that shaped both American and Filipino history in profound ways. The Philippine-American War stands as a reminder that American power, however well-intentioned, is still power. That the spread of American influence has come at a cost to those on the receiving end. That the gap between America's ideals and America's actions has always existed and perhaps always will exist. And that forgetting inconvenient history doesn't make it go away, it just ensures that we'll repeat it. For over a century, the United States has been a global power, intervening in countries around the world, sometimes invited, often not. Each intervention has been justified with similar rhetoric. We're bringing freedom, democracy, stability, prosperity. Sometimes those justifications have been sincere. Sometimes they've been cynical covers for strategic or economic interests. Often they've been both. The Philippine-American War was the first major test of whether America could be an empire and still be true to its founding principles. The answer, revealed in the torture chambers and burning villages and concentration camps of the Philippines, was that it could not. Empire requires compromise with ideals. Empire requires violence against those who resist. Empire requires forgetting or rationalizing away the suffering inflicted. America chose empire in 1898 and 1900. That choice had consequences that echo down to the present day. Understanding those consequences, grappling honestly with that history, is essential if we want to understand American power in the world. The soldiers who fought in the Philippines, both American and Filipino, deserve to be remembered. The civilians who died in the concentration camps and from the destruction of the war deserve to be remembered. The debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists deserves to be remembered. The whole messy, complicated, tragic episode deserves to be remembered, because the Philippine-American War is not just history. It's a mirror reflecting back truths about American power that we often prefer not to see. And it's a warning about the costs of empire, costs measured not just in money or even in lives, but in the corruption of the very ideals that empire claims to spread. Thank you for taking this journey through one of the most important forgotten wars in American history. The Philippine-American War may not be remembered by most Americans, but its legacy lives on in American military doctrine, in American foreign policy, in the relationship between the United States and the Philippines, and in the ongoing debate about America's role in the world. If there's one lesson to take from this long, complicated story, it's this. When a nation projects power across the world, when it intervenes in other countries, and when it tries to reshape societies through force, the costs are always higher than expected, the challenges are always greater than anticipated, and the gap between stated ideals and actual practice is always wider than we want to admit. The Philippine-American War taught that lesson in blood and suffering over a century ago. Whether we've learned it is another question entirely.